Ethan Mercer had not slept properly in 11 days. This was not unusual for him. Sleep had always been a negotiation, something he bartered with his body in exchange for one more hour at his desk, one more document reviewed, one more decision made before the morning light crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office on the 42nd floor of Mercer Capital's downtown Chicago tower. He was 38 years old, worth somewhere north of $4 billion depending on which market was having a bad week, and he had not been on a date since 2021. His assistant, Patricia, had stopped trying to set him up after the third cancellation. His mother had stopped calling about grandchildren after the fifth. The board of directors had stopped asking if he was okay after he'd presented a 90-minute quarterly earnings breakdown from memory without notes and without a single pause for water. Ethan Mercer was fine. Ethan Mercer was always fine. What Ethan Mercer was not, was sleeping. The insomnia had started after the Singapore deal collapsed, not because the deal mattered emotionally, but because for the first time in his career, he hadn't seen it coming. 48 hours before the signing, his entire intelligence network had shown green lights. And then, quietly, like a tide going out, the whole thing had simply dissolved. No explanation. No warning. He'd replayed every conversation, every data point, every handshake in a conference room that smelled like eucalyptus and corporate ambition, and still couldn't find the crack. That was the thing that kept him awake. Not the loss. The not knowing. It was Patricia who had suggested the voice therapy app, and she had done so in the way that Patricia suggested everything, by placing a printed summary on his desk without comment and waiting. The summary was 3 pages. He'd read it in 4 minutes. The app was called Solace. It was not a therapy app in the traditional sense. There were no video sessions, no questionnaires about your childhood, no prompt to rate your mood on a scale of 1 to 10. It was, according to the brochure, a voice-based companionship and reflection service. You called in. Someone talked with you. You talked back. The company described their team as trained reflective listeners, not therapists, not coaches, just people who knew how to listen and how to ask the right questions at the right time. Ethan had almost thrown the summary away. Instead, at 2:17 in the morning on a Tuesday, with the Chicago skyline glittering indifferently outside his window and a glass of scotch sitting untouched on his coffee table, he opened the app and pressed call. The hold music was soft. Not elevator music, something with actual texture to it, a low guitar line that didn't try too hard. And then the line connected. Hi. You've reached Solace. I'm Claire. What's on your mind tonight? He hadn't prepared anything to say. That was already unusual for him. I don't know, he said. I'm not sure why I called. That's okay, she said. A lot of people aren't sure. You don't have to know. Her voice was. He searched for the right word and couldn't find it. It wasn't soft exactly, though it was gentle. It wasn't warm the way people described voices as warm, like some kind of ambient heat. It was something else. It was present. Like she was actually in the room with him, like she had put down everything else she was doing and given him her full and unhurried attention. He wasn't used to that. He paid people to give him their attention, and even then it always felt slightly performative, slightly on edge, always waiting for the angle. This felt like no angle at all. I run a company, he said. A large one. Okay. I lost a deal recently. A big one. And I can't figure out why. And that's keeping you up. Yes. Is it the losing, or the not understanding? He paused. He reached for his scotch and then didn't drink it. The not understanding, he said. Tell me about that. So he did. He talked for 22 minutes without stopping, which was longer than he'd talked to any single human being in months about anything that wasn't a transaction. He talked about Singapore, about the data that had all pointed the wrong direction, about the way he'd felt standing in the lobby of the hotel at 5 in the morning after the call came through that the deal was dead, not devastated, not even angry, just confused. Like someone had moved a piece of furniture he'd walked past 1,000 times and he'd banged his shin in the dark. Claire listened. She asked questions at exactly the right moments, not to redirect, not to wrap up, but to go deeper. She asked what he thought the other party had actually wanted, underneath the contract terms. She asked whether he'd ever experienced uncertainty like this before in his career. She asked, quietly, whether it was possible that the not knowing was less about Singapore and more about something else. He didn't answer that last one. But he didn't deflect it either. He just let it sit in the air between them. When he finally wound down, There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable. Just space. You think very clearly, she said. Even at, what time is it for you? After 2. Even at after 2. You're precise. But I notice you described everything about the deal in terms of data and signals. You didn't mention how you felt about the people involved. I don't really think about business in those terms. No, she said. But you just spent 20 minutes trying to figure out why people did something unexpected. That's not a data problem. That's a people problem. And people aren't usually running on data. He was quiet for a moment. That's irritating, he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not a professional one. Not the kind of laugh people deployed to make clients feel clever. Just an actual, unguarded moment of amusement. It caught him completely off guard. Sorry, she said. I know. Don't apologize, he said. It was a fair point. They talked for another 10 minutes, slower now, less urgent. She didn't try to solve anything. She didn't give him a framework or a list of action items. She just kept him company in the specific way that the hour required, not filling the silence so much as making it less sharp. When he finally said goodnight, he realized his shoulders had come down from somewhere near his ears. He hadn't noticed them climbing. He slept that night for 6 hours straight. He called again the following Tuesday. And the Tuesday after that. By the third call, he'd stopped pretending there was a specific problem to discuss. He called because the week had been long and the apartment was quiet, and there was something about talking to Claire that reorganized his thoughts the way a good long walk used to when he was younger and had time for such things. She was sharp without being competitive. She pushed back without pushing him. She remembered things, not in a notes-reviewed, file-consulted way, but in the way of someone who had actually been listening, who had actually held what he said and kept it. He still didn't know what she looked like. The app had no profiles, no photos, no social layer. Just the voice. He told himself this was irrelevant. He was not a man who needed to see something to value it. He understood abstract worth. He worked in finance. But somewhere around the fourth call, around the point where she was making a quiet observation about the way he talked about his team, always strategically, never personally, and he'd felt something shift behind his sternum like a door he'd forgotten existed was moving on its hinges, he understood that what he was feeling wasn't just the relief of a good conversation. He was looking forward to Tuesday the way he hadn't looked forward to anything in years. He was listening for the sound of the line connecting the way people listened for footsteps in a hallway. He was, against every reasonable expectation he had ever set for himself, falling for a voice he'd heard 4 times, attached to a face he could not picture, belonging to a woman he could not find, because she existed only in the space between his phone and his ear and the particular quiet of his apartment at 2 in the morning. Ethan Mercer, who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time, was surprised. And he had absolutely no idea what to do about it till he called on a Wednesday that week. He told himself it was because Tuesday had been impossible, back-to-back board meetings, a flight delay out of O'Hare, a dinner with investors that ran until midnight. All of that was true. None of it was the reason. The reason was that he'd been thinking about what she'd said on the last call, the thing about his team, and he hadn't been able to let it go. He'd sat in a conference room that afternoon watching his VP of operations deliver a presentation and realized he didn't know the man's wife's name. Didn't know if he had kids. Didn't know anything about him outside the context of quarterly projections and risk assessments. The man had worked for him for 6 years. He'd called Patricia after the meeting and asked her to pull personal files on his senior leadership team. She'd paused for exactly 2 seconds, Patricia's version of visible shock, and then said she'd have them by morning. He didn't tell Claire any of that when she picked up. He just said hello, and she said hello back, and then she said, "You're calling on a Wednesday." "I know. Long week." "Getting longer," he said. "But that's not why I called." "Okay," she said. "Why did you call?" He looked at the window. The city below was doing what cities did at night, glittering and indifferent and full of people living at close range to one another in ways he'd never quite managed. "I did something today because of something you said last week," he told her. A brief pause. "Tell me." So he told her about the conference room and the VP of operations and the 6 years and the wife's name he didn't know. He told her about Patricia and the files. He didn't frame it as a confession. He just laid it out, the way he laid out everything, clearly, linearly, without decoration. When he finished, Claire was quiet for a moment. "How did it feel?" she asked. realizing you didn't know. Uncomfortable, he said, which surprised me. I don't usually register that kind of thing as a gap. But you registered it this time. Yes. What changed? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Someone reframed the question, he said. I was looking at a data problem. You pointed out it was a people problem. And once I started thinking in those terms, I couldn't stop. Another pause. Different from the first one, more considered. That's not a small thing, she said. Shifting the frame you use to understand something. Most people resist it. It threatens the whole structure. It should threaten mine, he said. I've built everything on reading situations correctly. If my frame has been off, he stopped. Then what? She asked. Then I need to know what else I've been misreading. She let that sit for a moment without rushing to fill it. That was something he'd come to notice about her, the way she treated silence as part of the conversation rather than a problem to be solved. Most people, especially people in his world, couldn't tolerate silence. It made them nervous. They filled it with words that didn't mean anything just to push the quiet back. Claire never did that. She let things breathe. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. You talk about your company a lot. Your team, your decisions, the deals. But you've never mentioned a single person in your personal life. Not a friend, not family. Is that intentional? He didn't answer right away. I don't know, he said finally. I don't think it was intentional. It's just, there isn't much there to mention. By circumstance or by choice? The question was precise in a way that made his jaw tighten slightly, not from irritation but from recognition. She had a way of asking things that didn't let you slide past them with a vague answer. Probably both, he said. Choice layered over so many years it started to look like circumstance. That's a very honest answer. You make it hard to be anything else. She was quiet for a beat. When she spoke again, her voice was a fraction softer, not emotionally softer but something more careful. You know this kind of service has limits, she said. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a substitute for the people in your life. I know what you are, he said. And then, because it was 11 at night and he was tired in a way that dissolved his usual precision, he added, I just find it easier to talk to you than to most of the people I'm supposed to be close to. Silence. Ethan. You don't have to say anything, he said. I know how that sounds. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm just telling you the truth because you seem to prefer it. She exhaled slowly. It wasn't a sigh of impatience. It sounded more like someone carefully setting something down. I do prefer it, she said. And I appreciate you saying it. I just want to make sure I'm not, that this isn't keeping you from building something real. It isn't, he said. I'm not confused about what this is. But even as he said it, he wondered if that was entirely true. Because what he felt on these calls was real. The sharpening of attention, the way the hour passed without wait, the particular quality of her laugh when something landed right, none of that was manufactured. He wasn't lonely enough or naive enough to confuse a voice service with intimacy. But he was honest enough, at least with himself, to admit that something was happening that didn't fit neatly into any category he had a name for. He started noticing her patterns the way he noticed patterns in everything. She always paused before asking the harder questions, as if she were checking something internally before she sent the words out. She used people's names more than average, said his name at natural points in the conversation in a way that felt grounding rather than performative. When something genuinely interested her, her pace picked up slightly, a slight quickening in her voice that she probably didn't notice herself. She was educated. Not academically formal, but the kind of educated that came from reading broadly and thinking about what you'd read. She had opinions she didn't volunteer easily but defended thoughtfully once drawn out. He knew he was building a picture from fragments. He knew that picture could be wrong in significant ways. He didn't have her face, her history, her full name, the city she was in. For all the things he could determine about a business target through research and inference, Claire existed outside the reach of any of that. She was only ever voice and attention and the particular quality of mind she brought to any given Tuesday, or Wednesday, night. And yet, he caught himself, on a call in late November, smiling at something she said before the meaning of it had fully registered. Just the sound of her getting to the punchline. He'd noticed the smile afterward, in the window reflection, and it had stopped him cold. not because he was ashamed of it, but because it had been involuntary. Ethan Mercer did not have involuntary reactions. He had considered responses and strategic deflections and the occasional calculated warmth deployed for professional effect. He did not just smile because someone's voice made him want to. In December, his firm threw its annual gala. Black tie, open bar, the kind of event that existed to remind investors that Mercer Capital was not just profitable but civilized. He stood near the bar for most of the evening, speaking when spoken to, performing the role with his usual efficiency, and found himself thinking about a completely unrelated question Claire had asked him 2 weeks earlier about what he'd wanted to be before he wanted to be rich. He'd told her he'd wanted to be an architect. She'd said she could see that. He'd asked her why. She'd said because the way he thought about problems was structural. He always wanted to know what was holding things up, what the load-bearing elements were, where the weak points lived. She said most financial people thought in flows. He thought in structures. She said it like it was a simple observation, not a compliment, which made it land more like a compliment than anything deliberate ever had. He stood in the middle of his own gala, surrounded by 500 people who depended on his judgment, and he thought about a woman he had never seen, and he thought about architecture, and he thought about the way some structures looked complete from the outside and had entire empty rooms inside that no one ever walked through. He left the gala at 9:30. He did not call Claire that night. It wasn't a Tuesday and it wasn't a Wednesday, and he was already bending the rules of whatever this was in ways that made him cautious. But he sat with his phone in his hand for a long time, looking at the app icon. And for the first time in his adult life, Ethan Mercer wanted to know what someone looked like, not out of strategy, not out of instinct, but out of something that lived below both of those things, something quieter and considerably more dangerous.